Jay,
Yeah,
how you doing?
great, Adam. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me into your home.
Absolutely.
And enjoy some Thai food.
Yes.
I know we're both a little bit hungry.
Definitely.
For people who may not be familiar with you, if you can just give a quick introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Jay Richards. I am a director of the DeVos Center at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and also the William E. Simons Senior Research Fellow at Heritage. I'm also a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, and I'm a bit of a shameless generalist. I've worked on different things over the years, the sort of intersection of science and faith. I've spent a lot of time working on the intersection of ethics and economics, and in fact was on the faculty at the business school at Catholic University for a number of years here in DC. And at Heritage, my primary focus is the battle over gender ideology, this idea that children are now getting in their heads that they could be born in the wrong body and maybe need drugs and surgery to fix it, which I think is a complete catastrophe for children, for parents, for civilization. And it's one of the sort of policy portfolios that we deal with at Heritage, and it's the one that I spend most of my time on at the moment anyway.
Wow. Well, let's start to eat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we fully dive into this. There's so many avenues that we can go.
Right. Yeah. Mine's pretty spicy, actually.
It is?
Yeah. I said mild, so I'm really glad I said mild.
This one's not too hot.
Okay, good.
So when I grew up as a kid, I didn't have any spicy food. My mom always made bland food, and she even admits it was bland.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I started traveling and I was like, you know what, let me refine my palate just a little bit. And I started purposefully having spicy food.
Okay.
Not every day or anything like that, but I wasn't avoiding it like I would before.
Sure.
So, like where I live at in New Jersey, tons of Indian food.
Oh, yeah.
So I was like, let me have it, dealt with it, drink the water. So, just constantly going through it. So now when I have a little bit of spice on my tongue now.
Okay.
It doesn't bother me.
No.
And actually, I'm kind of enjoying it.
You do acclimate. I mean, honestly, it wasn't until my wife and I moved to Seattle in the late 90s, actually. I was right out of graduate school. I'd never actually had Thai food. And, I suppose it was around, but Seattle was filled at the time with Thai food. And my wife and I had it like the first week, and we're like, why is this not everywhere? It's absolutely unbelievable. But there are kind of some surprise spices if you're not careful, for sure. But
yes.
But I'm a big fan whenever I can get it.
Yeah. By the way, have you been to Seattle since?
I haven't. In fact, I was just actually there this summer. And so usually there once or twice a year, try to go. And when I'm in charge of it during the summer, and then I usually go to a tech conference that Discovery Institute does actually every fall. So yeah, and we've still got some family that live out there. So try to make it out at least once a year.
Obviously you said you lived there in the 90s. What's the change that you've seen since? Because I would imagine it's dramatic.
It is. And in fact, it's funny you ask that because my daughter, Jillian Richards Agros, who happens to work also at the Discovery Institute, just wrote a major report on, it was like a 10,000 word report on what the left does to our great cities, because she was born in 1999 at the University of Washington Medical Center, right there at the University of Washington, sort of the height of the tech bubble. And I can say at the time, of course, Seattle was liberal, it was quite secular, but it was a happy place. It was energetic, it sort of felt the buzz of enterprise and entrepreneurship. The place worked, the bus system worked. I took it every day. And then right when we were moving out in 2013 to move to DC, that was when this woman that became one of the city council members, who was a avowed socialist, was running, and actually in our district. And so we feel like we got out just the right time. But since then, it's really, really depressing, especially to watch what's happened to downtown Seattle. A combination of kind of dysfunctional homelessness, which is not about housing, it's about other things, constant crime, drug abuse on the streets. Everybody maybe remembers the Chaz, this zone in what's called Capitol Hill in Seattle, that became its own sort of autonomous zone until some people got killed and raped. That's it in a nutshell, unfortunately. And of course, Seattle has so much wealth that it can squander a lot of wealth, but we're seeing the same thing happening in San Francisco. In fact, a great book by Michael Schellenberger, San Francisco, covers that. And I honestly think this is something that I say as a sort of political conservative and a public policy guy, we don't know how to fix these cities. I mean, our country has these profound, highly populous cities that are almost entirely taken over by the sort of far left at this point, and they're implementing their policies. It's causing people like Elon Musk to move out. I can tell you most of our friends, a lot of people we know that were in Seattle are now in Idaho or in Spokane, Washington, or in Texas. And there's a kind of death spiral underway, and it's really depressing to see, but it's even more depressing because it's not obvious. Like, how do you turn that around? Because as long as the population continues to vote for these politicians, they're going to keep getting the same policies. And so unless at some point they sort of connect the dots and say, okay, let's try something different, it's not clear how it returns. I mean, that did happen in New York under Giuliani in the 90s. And so we know it's at least possible, but it's not an obvious problem or an easy problem to solve. And I honestly don't think the conservatives really have a sense of, okay, even, if they put us in charge, I think we have the right policies, but I don't think we have a sense of, okay, what's the strategy for turning the cities around in the first place?
It's interesting because I see some of what's happened. I mean, obviously, as someone who doesn't live on the West Coast, and I haven't lived on the West Coast, I'm kind of living vicariously through people I know that live there and a little bit of the media. And I almost see like the West Coast, the cities in the West Coast, the major cities, as kind of like a social experiment where they're testing it out here. Yeah. And all the bad ideas are just being put into place and just seeing how does this go? Should we fund illegal immigrants? Just give them money.
That's right. Shall we give drug addicts the tools to continue the addiction?
What's that? Oh, it helps them if we give them meters? Okay, sure. Let's just give it a shot.
No, absolutely.
And even Gavin Newsom has said that homelessness, their ability to address homelessness has failed. So, when I look at places like New York City, I see some of the same things happening there. And now I've gotten to know some people who are like behind the scenes in New York City, who give me even more details. And basically what I find is, obviously right now, New York City is a one-party city, essentially. Sure. So the Democrats aren't worried about Republicans when they're running for office. They're running, excuse me, the blue dog Democrats, what you would typically expect. They're scared of the communists and the progressives. Right? They're scared of them. So they're scared that they're going to mobilize and try to run against them. Even though they're the minority, they're scared of them. So what they do is they give an inch. Absolutely. And then they keep giving inches and keep giving inches. And then you end up with, someone like Joe Biden saying, gender affirming care, as if he knows what that even means.
He's been years thinking, I think it's just great for men to be able to go in women's bathrooms, right? Yeah, that's how it happens. A small kind of radical core, which might be, in terms of demographic, an extreme minority, but is completely dedicated to a cause, can turn things in that way. And that's something that people don't often understand. They say, well, gosh, like the gender stuff, this has to be a really small percentage of the population. But what they're thinking of is that the percentage of the population, say, that has gender dysphoria. Okay, yes, that's a small percentage, but that's not a political constituency. The gender ideology we're experiencing, it's an ideology that uses people who have struggle with their bodies or people that, say, have disorders of sexual development. They use those as a kind of front for a radical ideology that's really about deconstructing and dissolving our categories of reality. And male and female, those are really stable categories of reality based on our observations of reality. If you can destabilize those, you can destabilize almost anything. So that's what it's actually about. And that the ideologues understand that. But even then, there aren't that many of them, but they're well placed, they're influential, they're absolutely dedicated to their cause. I'll give you an example of how powerful they are. A month or so ago, President Biden, before he dropped out of the race, suddenly came out and said that the White House was opposed to these gender transition surgeries for minors, which was a surprise because they've spent 4 years pushing it in every possible way they can. Right. I thought, wow, okay, I wonder how long this will last. It lasted 7 days, and then the White House issued a clarification basically retracting what it had said. Now, how did that happen? It happened because of some very powerful forces. If I had to guess, it would be the ACLU and the Human Rights Campaign and GLAAD, these very powerful nonprofits, basically threatened the White House, said, look, if you want our support during the 2024 election, you need to change your policy. That is hardball politics. And in some ways, it's almost admirable because they're absolutely dedicated to their cause. And the question is, if those of us, whatever you want to call it, the coalition of common sense and reality, need to have something like that single-minded dedication if we want to fight it. But that's how these things go. No one, probably a small percentage of the population in Seattle thought, oh, let's have anarchy, right? Where people just suddenly declare autonomous zones in neighborhoods. Nobody sort of consciously thought of that, but that's exactly where they ended up.
Right.
But at least at the moment, there hasn't been a changing of the guard. There's not been a kind of political repentance. There's, I think people still more or less in the city of Seattle have the same political views that they had before. What's happening is there's a kind of bleeding of productivity and businesses and people from Seattle proper to what's called the East Side. So Bellevue and Woodinville and Bothell, which are just on the other side of Lake Washington, which are, there's basically suburbs divided by a lake. You go to downtown Bellevue now, it's absolutely impeccable and beautiful, but that's how Seattle was in the 90s. You never feared for crime in downtown Seattle, even at night in the 1990s and even the 2000s. So this doesn't take a long time. It can happen just, a handful of years.
It makes me think if we'll use the Biden administration, you were using an example of maybe the ACLU and GLAAD. Sometimes I feel like politicians and even the political party in general, they overestimate the influence of these organizations. It's almost like they nag them, giving them the impression that they have millions of people behind them, and really it's 100. Yeah. Right. And so they bend because actually it reminds me of how corporations act when people complain on Twitter.
Absolutely.
And it's like and then when they look it up, it's really 13 people. And it's like, so they change everything because, oh my God, 13 people, which feels like hundreds.
Feels like a lot because they're really loud.
Right.
Yeah. They're really insistent. And I think that's part of it. I do think that the reality is there's a lot of money behind this stuff too. I mean, you've got a handful of billionaires, people like Jennifer Pritzker and the Arcus Foundation, Martine Rothblatt, that have funded a lot of the gender stuff on the other side. But then they fund very vocal nonprofits. And I think even if, say, they're sort of Democratic politicians that understand, okay, this is a small constituency, I think they fear that they can make life miserable for me in an election. And so they could, in theory, the Human Rights Campaign could primary a Democrat that was insufficiently committed to their cause. And so I think that they sort of fear that, because if it was just literally electoral politics and counting up the potential votes, this wouldn't make any sense at all.
Actually, you bring up a good point as far as getting behind someone who's going to primary them. So I can see that. I don't know, but there's just something about it where it makes me think that it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Not to say that the ACLU doesn't have some sort of influence.
That's right.
But even as someone who's now getting into the media, I see a bit of this as smoke and mirrors as well when it comes to media. If I inundate you with content over and over and over, I can give you the false impression that this is a really big issue that's affecting a lot of people when it's really this.
That's right.
And so I almost feel like when it comes to these organizations, do they have some money? Sure. Could the ACLU start a lawsuit? Sure. That would be annoying. Yeah. But at the same time, it makes me think when it comes to election season, I mean, if they're already so biased that they would never support a Republican, I mean, what are they going to do?
No, yeah, exactly. I know that's what's hard, and that's more or less what happens, among Republicans and conservatives. Is conservatives always the sort of social pressures cause them to drift to the left. That doesn't happen on the left. I mean, it's been called O'Sullivan's Law for John O'Sullivan, and it's been named for different people, but the idea is every organization that is not actively right-wing becomes left-wing over time. Like you never get a charitable foundation that kind of mission creeps to the right. It just never happens. And part of that, I think, is honestly the kind of political incentives, because if you're very much over on the left, that gives government a bunch of stuff to do, right? It's a great thing about, say, Keynesian economics is it gives governments a lot of kind of tools by which they imagine they can sort of govern the economy. Whereas, a general conservative stance is that God gave us government for very specific reasons, and it has an absolute role to play in our social life, but it shouldn't be in charge of everything. And in fact, it's incompetent to do stuff at certain things, and it actually harms the society when it gets involved in certain things. Right. And so there's always going to be this kind of asymmetry between the left and the right that requires some people with real intestinal fortitude and spines to be able to fight that. And at the moment, I mean, we see a lot of that in the states. We were blessed to have a federated system with 50 states, which have their own sovereignty. And so on, say, this issue of the gender medicine with minors, as of this year, so 2004 or 2024, so from 2021 to 2024, we basically have gotten 25 states to pass laws restricting or prohibiting this gender medicine. So, sort of social transition followed by puberty blockers and then cross hormones and then surgery. 25 states. So half the states have passed laws restricting these things, even though lots of medical organizations insist that it's the proper standard of care. Right. Those of us on our side, I think I thought most of those bills would have a hard time in the courts because the courts reflect the culture around us. But in fact, they have fared pretty well. And one of these laws has actually been taken up by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court's going to rule on these, I think, in fairly short order. That's significant because even when you have the administrative state and the executive branch run by someone who, for whatever reason, has committed themselves to this ideology, half the states can fight back and resist it and get the arguments at least presented in federal court. And so I think that's in some ways, it's sort of like there's a theory about the appendix, right? For a long time, we were told that the appendix in the body was this vestigial organ and it didn't have any function. There's now a hypothesis that what the appendix actually does, or at least one of its functions, is that it holds sort of the microbiome. So like the microbiome that's in our guts that we rely on for a lot of things. Sometimes something happens and kills off the good flora in our guts. We might have to take antibiotics, for instance. And so the appendix is like a little emergency storehouse for the microbiome so it can repopulate. The states can be that too. You can have a kind of catastrophe in the body politic in the United States at the federal level. In a powerful state like Texas or Florida, or even Oklahoma, which is much smaller, can resist and can become a basis for resistance. And so that's sort of how I see these things. Everything isn't decided ultimately, thank God, in Washington, D.C. We've got 50 state capitals that also have a say.
So some people don't know this, but I was a Democrat before. These days, I would consider myself an independent. And I pulled away, I want to say, I really started pulling away 2019, leading into 2020.
Was it the lockdowns? Like, was there a triggering thing?
It was prior to the lockdowns, but the lockdown solidified a bunch of things for me. I was like, I'm done. Especially watching the primary with Joe Biden being artificially propped up. I was like, what is this?
Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Exactly. Like I was very much so in tune to what was happening. He won one primary. Everyone drops out. I was like, what just happened?
So strange.
It was very strange.
Bernie was completely sandbagged. I mean, there's so many strange things like this.
But Joe Biden's my friend.
What happened? I know. Did they have some, I don't know, some private pictures of you? I mean, they somehow threatened you to change path.
But I mentioned that because I think prior to COVID and the lockdowns, I never fully appreciated having 50 states with 50 separate governments.
Yeah.
But in a case of an emergency like that, I really got to see, oh man, I'm really glad that we're not all suffering
Yes.
because of DC's choice.
Exactly.
You know, I live in New Jersey. It was weird because, I mean, we stayed locked down decently long. Obviously, Florida was one of the first to really try to open up.
Yep.
Was it Christie? No, never locked down.
And of course, in Christie, in South Dakota, of course, there's not a lot of population, but like Georgia and Florida, there's a lot of population, and they were quick. Yeah.
They were quick. New Jersey eventually came around to it. But what was weird was, like, when we got rid of restrictions, they never went back.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm not far from New York.
Yes.
And it was the complete opposite.
Absolutely.
It was like dystopian land.
It really was.
And it was only 30 minutes away.
Yeah.
No one wanted to go into New York City.
The West River was a completely, the virus was just a completely different strategy depending on which side the river is on.
Right. And obviously there were people from New Jersey who commuted to New York.
Yeah.
So it's just like, you know, at the time my wife was working in Manhattan. And she's like, I gotta go there. I gotta wear this stupid mask. And then she would come back home and she had freedom.
Yes.
You know, she can take this off and breathe.
You feel that in your body. Right. Right. That's not like, okay, I've read a policy paper and been persuaded. This is very visceral contrast based entirely on baseless political decisions, as we now know. You know? Yeah.
And there's no rhyme or reason. It was just what they were kind of feeling. Even down to New York State was, I mean, my wife was one of them, forcing, well, one, the state was encouraging companies to force their employees to get vaccinated.
Right.
And my wife at the time was working for a particular medical institution.
Yeah.
And they said, you have to do it by this date or you're fired.
Wow.
And she waited basically until the last day, but she made that choice.
Yeah.
But me saying choice is coercion.
Oh, no, yeah, no, exactly. It's like, okay, yeah, if you want to keep your job, you're going to do this. I mean, that was, to me, I had spent 2020 with a couple of colleagues actually writing a book about the lockdowns called The Price of Panic. And so it feels sort of bad that I was able to use the extra time that the lockdowns provided to write a book trashing the lockdowns. But you pour yourself into something like that to do it on a short timeline. And then all of a sudden the vaccine appears, right? Which I had not done any research on it, but I had COVID right at the end of 2020. So I thought, okay, well, obviously I'm not going to get a vaccine right if I've had the bug. I know how immunity works. And then suddenly they're trying to force us to take it. It wasn't until the sort of mandate, when they were mandating people to take it, even if they had already had it, that I thought, okay, this is not your sort of typical situation. And then when I looked into it, I thought, okay, this is, again, it's just like the kind of, what I now think is the kind of biomedical security state that was working behind the scenes. We just didn't really realize it until it kind of came online in 2020. I now think it's one of the greatest threats to constitutional government. And there still really hasn't been a reckoning, even though maybe half the population is at least awake to the problem. So we're better off in that way than we were prior to 2020, but we still haven't fixed it.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I sat down with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya.
Yeah.
And I thanked him for his involvement in fighting against OSHA. Because, trust me, I don't actively listen to Supreme Court justice arguments and stuff like that. Like,
you don't?
I don't. But I was listening to that. And because for me, I was like, this is directly, the federal government is directly going to affect my daily life.
Absolutely.
By either nagging me to death or basically nagging me into the point where I just say, F it, I will get the vaccine. Yeah. When I didn't want to.
Right, exactly.
At that moment.
Yeah.
So I was always for, if they're going to come up with a vaccine, here's a choice.
Yeah. Just give us the data. Yeah.
Right.
Informed consent. It can help you. It can reduce symptoms so far as we can tell. And so in certain circumstances, that would be valuable for you. But we know that the risk of COVID varies massively by orders of magnitude between the young and the old. If you've already had the bug, it may not make sense to get this vaccine. And here are the risks, right? Yeah. There would not have been a problem. I don't think anybody would have had a problem. It was the suspiciously fast and porous timeline for the drugs, followed by weird trashing of pre-existing alternative drugs, followed by these draconian mandates that, to me, it sort of, my spidey sense went off at that point. If it was just a vaccine, I hadn't spent any time thinking about it. It might not have alerted me to this. No, I've since studied more about vaccines in general, which, again, I would never have done. And I don't think the CDC and the NIH realizes what it's done to public perceptions of public health and vaccines in general. They are the number one source of vaccine skepticism and vaccine hesitancy because of the way that they've handled this. And honest questions from parents, or instead of giving them an honest answer, they're just sort of treated as pariahs. They are creating a population of vaccine skeptics across the board now that I don't think they would have imagined in 2019.
No, I would have, years ago, I would have said, listen, the CDC said it. It's likely that's the case. Let's just follow their recommendations.
Absolutely.
They're the experts. I'm not. But watching the lack of common sense being perpetuated by people who are the so-called experts, but also watching the politics involved in policy. I'm sorry, politics involved in medical policy to try and keep us safe. I was like, but what does that have to do?
Right.
If Trump said it's good, now it's bad. If Trump says it's bad, now it's good. And it's just like, either it works or it doesn't.
Yeah, and I don't think that, who supports it doesn't determine that.
And then on top of that, we're all stuck at home watching the news. And the news is funded by the very companies that want us to take their products.
No, this is the perennial problem, is that the corporate media absolutely depends upon, I'll just use cliche, big food and big pharma. Without that, is like bread and butter. And so the likelihood that you're going to get major exposés of something a pharmaceutical company does from one of these corporate entities, that's what these media companies mostly are, is remote. And then when you realize that in fact the administrative state, so things like the CDC and the FDA, and the entities in the private sector that they regulate, they're not adversaries very often. They're often working together in a kind of massive collusive activity that in some ways makes our situation more complicated now. In the 20th century, you could sort of, as a heuristic, talk about the public sector and the private sector. And there was the Soviet Union and the communists. They wanted to collectivize industry and have the state control all the private sectors. That didn't work. It's a disaster. That's why we won the Cold War. But it's not that simple anymore, because the reality is, there's a private sector and there's a public sector, but very often large, especially multinational corporations, are these kind of weird hybrids with the government regulators. In fact, it's often the same people that go in and out of these jobs. And so we got to come up with a way of accounting for that is not overly simplistic. In political theory, you would call this corporatism or even fascism. Fascism implies usually that there's a kind of a military sort of center of focus. But the economic model of fascism is one in which you still have official private sector companies, but it's almost entirely controlled behind the scenes by the state. And so they don't balance each other out. And so this is my medium-term worry. It's not that we're going to get Soviet state socialism again, because it's such a disaster. It'd be obvious. What we're going to get is different versions of this kind of corporatist blob. It'll have a particular form in the United States. It'll have maybe a more virulent form, say, in China. But there'll be variations of each other, and we won't really have a free society at all. That's my main worry.
Yeah, speaking of, because before we were talking about fasting and health and all this stuff, I almost feel like the top regulatory organizations in my lifetime have had massive failures.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So Bernie Madoff in the SEC, we have was it the Boeing 737 Max and the plane crashes,
right? And
we just have Boeing inspect their own stuff. It was like, okay. I wonder if that will ever go wrong. We've obviously seen the CDC.
Yeah. Well, and the one you skip would be the financial crisis of 2008, which was based upon all this securitization of mortgage loans. And those were developed, that wasn't kind of unfettered capitalism. That was a result of specific fair housing policies by the government, which ultimately destroyed the underwriting standards on loans. It caused a lot of these companies to fail. And then, of course, the government jumped in and bailed them out. That's so complicated, though, that I don't think most people quite realize that's what was happening. It's COVID, almost more than anything, and the lockdowns and the vaccines that have awakened people to this problem, the big blob, whatever you want to call it. That's actually, I'm thinking of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's actually been on this beat for several years. I don't agree with everything he says, but he knew this was a problem long before 2020, and he was on the right side on a lot of that stuff too. And that's something to be taken seriously. And honestly, we've got one of the most hopeful things that's happened in the last couple of months, in my mind, was actually this remarkable coming together of Robert F. Kennedy and Donald Trump, which no one a year ago would have thought it was remotely likely to happen. But if you listen to RFK Jr.'s speech, in which was ultimately endorsed Donald Trump, but the speech is very substantive, in which he lays out this massive increase of chronic diseases among the population and in children in particular. Really, really detailed. Everything from increases in autism. I would add massive social contagions like gender dysphoria, all sorts of type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, which some people call type 3 diabetes, obesity in the young. These are serious problems. And the problem is that I think a lot of people think, well, that's just because we're eating too much or we're gluttonous. No, actually, it's much of it is the result of this corporatist blob that thinks it's going to tell us how to eat. So, for instance, the USDA spent a bunch of years programming us with that food pyramid, right? Don't eat fat, very sparingly eat fat, don't eat a whole lot of animal products, but eat lots of cereal, right? Eat lots of carbohydrates. Well, guess what? You can track the the release of the food pyramid and obesity and type 2 diabetes rates very, very specifically. Well, how's that happen? Well, it happens because of the USDA, which was designed basically to support the American food lobby. It's not a bunch of experts on nutrition science or anything like that, but they deigned to give us all advice about how we're supposed to eat. No one ever stopped and said, well, now, why would the USDA be in charge of that? What do they know about this, right? And so people actually did this. People actually thought they were helping themselves by eating a lot of low-fat stuff, eating a lot of processed carbohydrates. And then they made themselves massively insulin resistant, and we got massive historic increases in obesity and type 2 diabetes. People will initially say, yeah, that is a problem. What RFK saw and sees is that the problem is mainly induced and created by this kind of unholy alliance of food and drug companies and the administrative state here in Washington, D.C.
So as someone who, I travel at least once a year these days. At one point, I was traveling twice a year. Actually, I'm leaving next week. We're heading off to Turkey.
Oh, cool.
But the first time I traveled was in 2016, traveled by myself. The thing that you're in a different surrounding, obviously, things are different.
Right.
But the biggest thing I noticed was the food was different.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It was so different. I remember going to Vienna, went to this Irish pub in Vienna.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you have? And they have burgers. Oh, we have this specialty burger. Bring out the burger. It's a big burger. I was like, man, I'm probably not going to sleep well tonight. I was absolutely fine. When I went back to my Airbnb, I was perfectly fine. I was like, if I was in the States, I would be feeling terrible right now. But there was something about the food.
Different. Yeah.
Here, I'm lactose intolerant.
Okay.
I mean, I say that there's very, very few things. Like I can have some ice cream with certain ones.
Okay.
Most cheeses I don't agree with, but there are certain ones I can get away with, like provolone I can get away with. I can't have pizza. Okay. If I have pizza, say goodbye. One slice, I'm done. I had whole slices of pizza. I had whole pies. When I went to Italy, Germany, bouncing around, I had all different. There was only one time it was a very liquidy cheese that caused a problem for me abroad. And that was actually in Italy. But outside of that, I've had a whole bunch of dairy, a whole bunch of cheese, and I don't have nearly the same reaction as I do here.
Yeah. I mean, I hear this all the time. In fact, I've got something called eosinophilic esophagitis, which means my esophagus swells up if I eat dairy or egg.
Oh, wow.
And I had this problem for decades, really, and only, somewhat recently realized this is what was causing it. So it's not the lactose, it's the proteins. But what's weird is that this was a very, very rare condition. In fact, I've talked to a gastroenterologist who told me, yeah, there was a time 30 years ago, it was so rare that you put it into a national database because they were tracking it. And I had a gastroenterologist tell me a couple of years ago, he's in Texas, he said, now actually I have a case about once a week. Okay, so something's happening. And in fact, RFK mentioned this too. He's like, all this increase in allergies and food intolerances and asthma. Now, look, I don't know exactly what's causing this, but it's clear that something's causing it and that we're doing it. Because on the one hand, we have this kind of blessed abundance where we all spend a lot less on food than, say our ancestors did a century or two ago. That's great. It's wonderful that we don't have to spend, a third of our income just providing food for our families. That's a kind of blessed abundance. But I think we've made some kind of deal that we did not intend to make with things that we're doing with our food supply. And I don't quite understand what's causing this, but this should be a question that's on the table. It would be nice if it wasn't a partisan question, but at the moment it's not on the table. Like neither party's talking about it, right? So if it has to be partisan, if one party will just take up the cause and say, look, we need independent investigations into this, and it's not going to be these same people working at the CDC and working at the NIH that are getting legal royalties from the drug companies they're supposed to regulate. They're not going to be in charge of helping us figure this out because they're probably part of the problem. That needs to happen, and it would be amazing if our RFK Jr.'s endorsement of Donald Trump actually created an opening for that to really happen, because he decided clearly, okay, I've got this kind of one chance. This is probably the speech that more people will listen to and maybe even read than any other speech I've ever given. What am I going to do? I am going to lay out the case for this. It was actually a very disciplined speech. He didn't talk a lot about vaccines and things like that. He just sort of laid out, okay, here are the symptoms. We're causing this. If we need to love our kids more than we hate each other, and we got to come together and do something about it. I just think that it's profoundly important. It's exciting that I think Donald Trump made promises to RFK Jr. that, okay, we'll do something about this if I'm elected. And so, I think if that happens, we should encourage him to keep his word, because this is, to me, this is like that and the fertility crisis, the fact that we're not even having enough children to replace ourselves. Those are the two kind of major issues that we're dealing with in our culture that haven't yet found a kind of political constituency.
I wonder why, though, because, I mean, Grant, you don't have to leave the country to know that, something's up.
Yeah.
And I get there's competing ideologies as far as why people are unhealthy. You eat too much, you don't exercise enough.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'm sure, listen, that all of that may be true, but I almost feel like if the basis of your existence is what you put into your body, and the quality of it is going to be the quality of your body.
Right.
So if you're starting there and it's trash, well, the byproduct of eating trash is that you're going to feel like trash.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're going to have all different types of trash outcomes. And just because, I guess this is part of my problem with the regulatory bodies, is like, just because you don't get sick right away, then it's okay. It's edible.
It's fine.
It's fine.
It's generally recognized as safe, is what it's called. It's grass. And in fact, if you notice that the medical profession in the United States, it as a whole, and this itself is shaped by regulatory standards, is focused primarily on acute symptoms, right? So if you go to the hospital, you know, and you're choking or you're bleeding, obviously, or you got a bullet, they're really good at that. They're just not good at chronic disease. So if you've got type 2 diabetes, so you have blood sugar regulation problems, well, okay, if it gets too bad, they're going to give you insulin, which does bring your blood sugar down. It also, over time, makes your body much more insulin resistant, and then you have to keep taking more and more and more insulin, right? So it's treating a symptom that actually ends up making the symptom worse, as opposed to, okay, now wait, why is everybody getting type 2 diabetes all of a sudden, right? That's the question that they should be asking. And then what can we do to reverse that? In fact, a lot of doctors will tell you that you can't reverse type 2 diabetes. But then there's some others like Jason Fung in Toronto, Canada. It's like, no, actually, if you can change people's sort of dietary habits, put them on a serious fasting regimen, watch them as a physician, you can reverse type 2 diabetes, and he's doing it. But the incentives aren't aligned properly to make that kind of part of what's happening. The chronic disease epidemic, that emerges even as we're able to develop new technologies and new drugs to keep us from dying from acute problems, right? And maybe lengthen that amount of time at the end of our lives when they can keep us just barely alive but sick, right? But we're just not very good at focusing on the kind of the whole person and the whole system. And I do think the weird kind of regulatory apparatus that we've developed over time, maybe it was well-meaning, but it is, I think, largely to blame for the chronic disease crisis that we have.
I agree with you. And, you know, we were talking about before with me losing weight.
Yeah.
And utilizing fasting and learning more about fasting, because obviously, like, you hear stuff, people are like, oh, try fasting. And you're like, oh, I don't
know the details.
I don't know the details. But when I started looking at it, the way I understand it is if you remove food from the equation, your body heals itself.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh shit, I never really thought about that.
Yeah.
And I was like, so I do nothing and my body takes over.
Yeah.
And learning about the different stages as far as what it does.
Yes.
I think a lot of people feel like, well, if I don't eat, then it's going to be in perpetuity of hunger, and it's just going to get worse and worse.
And I'm going to shut my metabolism down. I'm going to lose all my muscle. I'm going to store fat. Right? I taught that. I mean, in college, I was a strength trainer in the fitness center where I went to college, and would, you know, you have someone that come in, a fellow student, and she'd say, you know, I feel like I'm overweight. I'm not in shape. I can remember telling people, okay, eat 6 small meals a day, lots of kind of complex carbohydrates, carb load, because you want to eat really frequently because otherwise your body will go into starvation mode. Well, that was the orthodoxy. Not true. It's just not true. Yeah. And if you look at historic patterns of eating, the reality is for most of human history, people sometimes had a lot to eat, sometimes had a little to eat, sometimes had nothing to eat, right? And so you had the kind of punctuation of different modes. And so it would occur to people that, okay, well, we had to be able to survive that. So that's good. That's why we can store fat. It's possible to survive a period of time without eating. It didn't occur to people that actually maybe that's how we're optimized. Maybe God made us so that we're better off when we actually replicate that. Even if you get in a period where, look, you can get a Frappuccino 24 hours a day, you will still be healthier and better, and your brain will work better if there are times when you just don't eat anything. That doesn't mean, you also have feasts, like, or if you're Catholic, you have feast days. In fact, every Sunday is a little mini feast day. But then there's other times when you just don't eat at all. And if you do that and you do it properly, you will end up metabolically flexible, in which your body can convert carbohydrates to sugars, and it can use that, or it can convert fat to ketones, and it can use that. Yeah. But if you're loading your body continually with simple carbohydrates, your body never learns how to use fat for fuel. It just gets really good at storing it. That's a kind of key thing that is exciting to me, because it's based on a lot of the most recent research on the physiological effects of fasting. And it affirms and explains why we should retain these kind of traditional fasting traditions that, in fact, every culture and every major religion always had. We've just managed to drop it for whatever reason. Yeah.
I mean, I haven't been fasting because, one, I've been traveling a lot, and it's hard to mitigate all that stuff. But when I was doing it, it took about a week or two, and I kind of liked it. My wife liked it. We did it together. I had a lot more weight to lose than she did, but she was able to fit into all her old clothes.
Yep.
But I think the biggest thing that we weren't expecting was like how we felt in our stomach,
Yeah.
like our the gut reset that you experience. And I was like, oh, you know, because every time I usually measure, because I feel like my stomach is so sensitive. I usually measure how I feel based on how my stomach feels.
Interesting. That's not a bad idea.
And so because I always feel like I'm in between it being okay and bad.
Yeah.
Like it's just constantly going back and forth. But when I was doing that, and then my wife will cook every meal when I did eat, I felt so good.
Oh yeah.
I felt so good. And it really pointed out to me, it's like the quality of the food is really important.
Yep.
But also how frequently I eat is really important. Like I felt perfectly fine if I skipped breakfast, had a decent sized lunch that she would make, and then she would make some, and all our meals were protein focused.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing period, but I dropped so much weight so quickly.
Yeah.
There were times where I was losing like 5 pounds a week.
That's crazy.
And all I was doing was skipping breakfast, eating properly. We cut out the sugar. That's the other thing.
Biggies. Look, if you just limit the time window in which you eat, cut out the sugar, cut out ultra refined carbohydrates, and I think there's probably something to work using natural rather than kind of weird industrial oils. If you can do that, and now everybody's metabolism is a little different, but it is transformative and it will not shut down your metabolism. That's what people don't get, because the reason almost no diet works, or actually the diet works, almost every diet does work temporarily. Almost no diet works permanently because people always gain the weight back. And it's because the way that people tend to diet is to just restrict caloric consumption every day. And if you do that, your metabolism is going to slow down it wants to be in equilibrium. So it's basically like, oh, it's less food's coming in. I'm just going to slow everything down.
Right.
And then when you start eating normally again, you're right back where you started. Well, if you just, do temporary fasts, like if you can go, the data suggests that if you don't eat anything, not only will your metabolism not slow down, at the beginning, actually, you'll get an increase in norepinephrine and growth hormone, which both gives you energy and stores lean muscle mass. And about the third day it peaks. It takes until about day 5 for your metabolism to get back to baseline before it starts slowing down. So that means you can go 5 days without eating anything, and you will not downshift your metabolism as long as you sort of start up again. That's sustainable. But if you're doing something that just slows down your metabolism, first of all, you're miserable the whole time, and it's absolutely not sustainable.
We were doing, we were practicing fasting every other day. And what was very interesting about that, you would think, because we would weigh ourselves first thing in the morning.
Right.
So I would fast by, I would basically like skip breakfast. And maybe that would be at least 18 hours. Eat lunch and then eat dinner. The next day I weigh myself, I'd be down a little bit. That following day, I would eat 3 meals. The day after that, I would weigh myself. I would lose more after that day of eating. Yeah. It was like clockwork. Yeah. Every time. It would be like, after fasting, I would lose like 0.5 pounds. Then the next day, I would lose a pound. I was like, wait, I lost more. And
it's a little, there's the complexity in all this, and especially if you fast and eat in such a way as to get yourself into ketosis. So that is, get yourself into the state where your liver is converting fats either from your diet or from your body into ketones. That's called ketosis. And when you get into that state, your body sheds a lot of fluids. And in fact, this is why people that try this will often get what's called the keto flu, which is basically what happens. Your body just flushes all the fluids and the electrolytes go out with it. And so when you're doing this, you want to up your electrolytes. But so I always tell people, look, if you do it this way and you're going to start, say, eating ketogenically before you go into a fasting mode, expect your body to lose a lot of fluid. Don't get excited that you just lost 7 pounds of fat today. That's not really possible. But the long-term game is absolutely transformative because you have trained your body to be able to metabolize fat rather than just store it. We're all now experts at fat storage. Not very many of us are experts at actually, fat metabolism and actually helping our bodies to consume it.
Wow. Yeah, It's so cool that you wrote an entire book about it, though.
I mean, this is sort of, it's funny because in some ways it's sort of orthogonal to all my other work. Most of my work is, of course, kind of this idea stuff. But the fasting book, I mean, honestly, it was just a kind of a personal avocational interest. And I got really, really excited about it because I started reading the literature of people like Jason Fung and a lot of scholars that have worked on this, really serious people, and had been struggling as a Christian with the fact that we don't fast. Whereas if you look at Christian history for definitely over the first 1,000 years, Christians that were very serious about fasting, usually always fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays, had these long fasting seasons and Advent and Lent, and then also in the summer. That's mostly just completely disappeared. And when I talk to people about it, so I can't imagine fasting. I would get lightheaded and my brain wouldn't work in 4 hours. It wasn't until I started reading the fasting literature that I realized it's not just that we've gotten spiritually lame and so we're not fasting. It's that our lifestyle and our diet has made it really, really hard to fast because we're on this constant glucose sugar cycle, which is a 4-hour thing. And so it's not just that we're lame, it's that we are making it really hard to be able to fast. And my argument is if we can just make a few adjustments, actually, we'll be healthier, we'll live longer, and our brain will work actually much better.
Yeah, I agree with you. And actually, before I even started fasting, I did the typical, watch what I'm eating, we're not going to order out. My wife changed some of the, the ingredients of stuff, she was cooking a little bit more. But we cut out the processed and we cut out the sugar. And at the time, I remember I realized I was having like these like I guess you were talking about the glucose dip, where I was just like crashing. I was always crashing. So then I would go and get more coffee. But when I would have coffee, I didn't drink it black, so I would pour like a lot of creamer in it.
Absolutely.
So tons of sugar. So I'm just like, I'm basically drinking sugar to bring it back up. From crashing earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And artificially, it's just going to happen again.
Right. So we, excuse me. Once we realized that, and we were like, let's cut out the sugar, we started just looking at everything. Like, oh, we got to get rid of this. So we just slowly replaced stuff over like a matter of a few weeks. Where we saw like, we shouldn't have that. The oils is another big thing. My wife got rid of all the bad oils, only good oils. And she's constantly like, I looked this up and this is even better. So she was, and that's not, the oils is a big thing I never thought about. The difference between having like grilled chicken at home versus going to, some around the corner shop is that the around the corner shop pours a ton of oil on it.
And some kind of weird oil that's gone through some weird process. It's from something like cottonseed, right? Or corn oil. It's like, corn's not oily. So what are they doing to get oil out of this, right?
Exactly. So, I always tell people who are interested in getting into fasting, like, it's almost like detoxing from drugs.
Definitely.
You have to get rid of the sugar in your life so that you don't have that withdrawal system.
That's
symptom,
right.
And I would have that.
Absolutely. Your body, you really are on that cycle. That's why in my book, Eat Fast Feast, actually I set up a 6-week kind of transition plan. Because what I want is for people not to just try it, but to actually have a lifestyle change where they integrate it into their lives. But that requires some adaptation of your body. And so I actually just encourage people first to actually just eat ketogenically for about a week so that your body gets used to that, right? And then you start narrowing the time window in which you eat, and you keep narrowing it over a period of weeks until you're in a position where if you wanted to, you could fast for 3 days.
Right. The most we did was, I think the most I did was, it wasn't 36, but it was close to.
Okay. So you would like 2 nights basically. That's actually the big hump. I mean, so you go to sleep the first night, you go all day, and then you have to go to sleep the second night, right? Hungry. But that's by far the biggest hump I found is that the 36 hours. And then, you'll get the kind of up and down cycle. Or at least in my experience, you hit about day 5. And you lose the sense of hunger. It's a kind of a strange sensation. Now, the thing is, though, is day 5 or 6 is you start getting cold because your metabolism really slows down. And so I tend to think, except for certain circumstances, that probably is about the total length people would want to go, normally at least, without eating food.
Yeah, doing the every other day, While we were getting used to it, I also felt like it was good to keep that pace because we weren't feeling like we were keeping ourselves, like we were depriving ourselves.
Exactly.
You know, so it's like, all right, today we just won't have breakfast, and we'll make sure we eat lunch at this particular time so we hit our 18 hours.
Okay.
You know, so but outside of that, and if it's a particular day where I'm like, man, I don't even feel like eating lunch yet. You know, I would have an early dinner, and then I would be done. You know, so there was a lot of that where my hunger even just kind of decreased over time.
Yeah.
Even when it did come. But just recognizing when the hunger comes, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to eat at that moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of that, I mean, your body is responding to habit. Right. So very often it's sort of, again, like, it's like my car now. I get in my car, and unfortunately, it's a very smart car. And so if I were to get in it, you know, at 5 o'clock, wherever I am, it's going to tell me Gold's Gym is 25 minutes away because it knows that that's where I go after work, right? It will, when I get in the car in the morning, Heritage Foundation is 28 minutes away. Your body's the same way. Oh no, this is when you normally eat. Come on, you know, and it's prompting you. But if you break that cycle, it doesn't do that.
Right. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Man, I didn't know we were going to talk about fasting.
No, exactly. I don't think it was a plan, but it's actually really easy to get me talking about that subject, though. Yeah, I always say, if you want to know how to distract me, ask something about fasting.
That's awesome. Were you always in shape, or
So I would say I was a skinny kid. I was ran track and was frankly somewhat uncoordinated. And so you know, in high school, like I remember my sophomore year in high school, I was 6'3" and 137 pounds, and was at that stage where there's nothing you could do to gain weight. You know, I could eat a pint of ice cream and it would just heat me up, but you know, I'd speed up the metabolism. And so that sort of drove me crazy for a long time. And I started lifting weights in high school, and then I really got into it in college. And so that's when I kind of had an avocational interest other than playing a little lacrosse and stuff like that. It was really lifting weights, plus nutrition and fitness. And so I have retained that this whole time, you know, different, in some ways it's sort of a hobby for me. So I'm just really interested in these things. And so that was certainly part of it, is doing that. And I really do, from direct experience, think that if you keep your body working and you keep yourself fit, even if you don't have a physical job, right? Maybe your job is entirely cerebral. Your brain is going to work better if you're in shape than if you're not. And fasting and ketosis, it just sort of emphasizes that. In fact, that's how I discovered fasting. I was needed to have a medical procedure done. I was supposed to go, I think it was 36 hours without eating, and because they were going to put a tube in my esophagus. And I thought, this is crazy, 36 hours, it's going to be terrible. But I had been eating low carb. And so, you know, about the end of that period, I decided I was going to go ahead and work out. I thought, this is going to be terrible, you know, but I'm going to do it. And I noticed actually I feel quite energetic and my brain feels really, really clear. I feel really lucid. So I did what anyone did do. I Googled mental effects of fasting. And that's when I discovered, I had probably passed into ketosis. I wasn't used to that. My brain was loving the ketones. And that's what got me down the kind of rabbit hole on the fasting literature, was just stumbling upon this. And so I honestly think I would do it if that were the only benefit. And it's just one of many, actually.
Yeah, that was another thing I noticed. With me writing articles, it basically cut my writing time in half.
Yeah.
Like I felt like I could think clearer. There were times I would have to get up more frequently because I'm losing my train of thought and I'm easily distracted. After I started doing that, especially during the phase of fasting, like I went from writing articles like 3.5 to 4 hours to 1.5 to 2 hours.
Oh yeah,
max.
I believe it.
I was like, oh man, I'm done.
It's unbelievable. No, it really is, and no one would guess that.
Yeah.
Everyone imagines, okay, all I know is that if I go 2 hours past my normal eating window, I am hangry and I can't think straight, and all I can think about is food. I'm not getting closer to God, that's for sure, because all I can think about is a Cinnabon. And so they just sort of extrapolate that and assume that that's just going to keep being that way, and they don't realize now you've gotten yourself in a particular way of eating that's creating that problem, and you could get yourself out of it.
Yeah. I would be remiss to not bring up faith. So you probably saw that I was just baptized.
Yes.
I was just curious from your vantage point, are you noticing more people like myself who are maybe just, I would even say since like COVID, coming closer to God?
What I see happening is a kind of increase in the extremes, basically. And so people that follow these things have noticed the rise of the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, so people that don't have any religious, that don't like identify in any way. They don't say, I'm evangelical, I'm Protestant, I'm Jewish. They just say none. And there's a rise in that population. Now, that doesn't mean they're all atheists, but it does mean they're just completely sort of detached from things of faith. There's a rise of that, but if you look at where faith is increasing, it's actually among what I'll just call it kind of generically the Orthodox, so the really serious. So people that as an adult, right, nobody decides, okay, I'm going to go get baptized as an adult because they want, just some kind of thin gruel social gospel thing. It's almost always, okay, well, actually, I think this is true and it's life transforming, and so I'm going to do this. And so if you look in the Catholic Church, if you look at who's going to seminary, it's not a bunch of liberal flakes, right? It's like really, really serious men that take this stuff seriously. And that's what I think is happening. I think in some ways the culture, the kind of semi-religious kind of progressivism that persisted as a kind of public culture in the United States in the 20th century, because that was the kind of the mainline Protestantism, right? Union Theological Seminary in New York in the 1950s. That was the kind of official kind of cultural consensus. That's almost entirely disappeared. And what you've got is new startup churches in Protestant context and robust Orthodox parishes and congregations in Catholic context. And I think in some ways that's much more natural and much healthier, though it would be I think it would be nice if the culture, if we were to return to what I think was the founding ideal, which is that people have their religious traditions, and those are many and complicated, but the existence of a creator and the existence of a natural moral law, those aren't merely sectarian truths. They're truths of reason. They're public truths. So that's why even Thomas Jefferson, who's the least orthodox probably of the founders, could talk about nature, laws of nature and nature's God, because those were taken to be truths that you could know by reason. Right. I think that's a much better and much more stable synthesis than what we have now, which is a kind of enforced progressive secularism in which any reference to God or to morality is somehow sectarian. And I would love to, and I hope that we'll witness a return to that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I'm curious because I've been talking about this a little bit more and more, because it's one of those things that obviously with me coming closer to God, and accepting Christ as my savior, I'm always curious about the arguments for Christ as well. And obviously there was apologetics and all this, I started watching more of that, but I also started coming across near-death experience.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I feel like for people who have kind of studied it, they're like, there's something here.
There is something there. Yeah.
And, the way I kind of argue it is, one, most people are bad at acting, right? Yeah. So the idea that there are thousands upon thousands of people who are just these amazing actors who on cue can cry when they talk about their experience seeing Jesus Christ. Yeah. Or how they felt and things of that nature, that they're all just grifters of some sort.
Exactly.
When the reality is that most of them are reluctant to even talk about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Not all of them go to heaven. Yeah. Some of them have hellish experiences.
Some are terrible experiences, yeah.
Some of them absolutely terrible where they have PTSD. Yeah. So, when I hear this, it reminds me of there's a guy I know who's atheist, and I was talking to him about this. Yeah. And he was like, well, I heard that there are pilots who experience the same type of feeling.
Under G-forces.
Yeah. And I'm like, these aren't pilots, though.
No, they're not pilots. And they're actually not at 8G. Yeah. And the experience is so and this can happen, in which they will have an impression that they're sort of outside their bodies, right, from behind.
Right.
What they do not have is personal visits with loved ones, right? They do not have a kind of an awareness of this being of light and love. That doesn't happen, right? You can have that. So yeah, of course, there are going to be the kind of elements of this that you can see in other ways. I absolutely think, look, if you say, okay, let's treat the existence of God and of the spiritual realm, if you're willing to say it's possible, and it's possible that there could be evidence for it, then what you don't want to say is, okay, God needs to prove it to me, which is strange, because you wouldn't say that if you were a detective trying to figure out what happened in the scene of a crime, you would want to say, well, I'm just going to treat this as an accident unless the evidence jumps out at me. What you want to do is you dispose yourself to follow the evidence of the clues. Right. In the same way, if you're open to God's existence, if you're open to a continued existence after bodily death, then what kind of evidence would you look for? And when you do that, the evidence is absolutely remarkable. It's more than sufficient, I think, to make it clear that it's reasonable to believe these things. Just like I think there's evidence both from our knowledge of the natural world, there are philosophical arguments for God's existence when it comes to the resurrection and the historicity of Christ and the Gospels. There are good historical arguments for those kinds of things. But what you want is a kind of buildup of a cumulative case. First, the arguments, I think, against materialism are decisive. The arguments for the existence of a creator and purpose in the universe are very strong. The arguments that we can't be reduced merely to our bodies, that we actually have freedom. All those things sort of come together and point in a particular direction. Right. I think only if you sort of decided ahead of time that you're committed to materialism, well, then, God's not going to make it that, he's not going to force you if you want to be committed to that. The evidence is never going to be quite that strong. That's what Pascal said, that the evidence is sufficient for those who are inclined and willing to believe, but not so strong that it forces people to believe.
Yeah. And there are stories of verifiable information as far as when they have an experience. So what I mean by that is hearing conversations, verifying that, I heard one story where they're in the United States, but they have family in India, and they had traveled to India, and they saw their family members, saw what they were wearing, what they were talking about, and was able to verify that this happened. And it was very spooky for them to hear that. There's one particular story. There's a book called Imagine the God of Heaven by he's a pastor in Texas named John Burke. And the person he was interviewing was on the surgery table. They left their body and they were floating above their body. And when they floated above their body, they saw on the top of the lamp. Okay. On the top of the lamp, they saw a red sticker. They have their entire experience. They eventually come back. They tell the nurse, I was outside my body. They didn't believe them. They said, I saw a red sticker on top of the lamp. They went and verified that there is a red sticker on top of the lamp. Crazy. And so for them, that even they didn't know that. No. And she would have no way of even knowing that as a patient being rolled into the OR. Of course. So these are particular stories, people who are blind who see things. People who have experiences seeing a loved one, someone they know that they're related to but don't know who it is. Exactly. One particular story, finding out that the person that she saw on her mother's deathbed found out that was her father. Oh. And was able to describe him in great detail. And she's like, "That's the man that I saw when I was passing." So like, there are all these different stories that happen. You can convince me that some of them are lying, maybe 10 of them are lying. Okay. But there are accounts from all over the world. Yeah, absolutely. And within John's book, and the major point that he's trying to make is that the stories, no matter which culture they come from, whether they're Muslim, atheist, it doesn't matter. Their stories tend to verify in some form or fashion the depiction of heaven or the afterlife, like the Christian depiction. Right, the vision of that. So whether they see Jesus or they don't see Jesus. Or they do and they wouldn't know it if they did. Well, that's actually the fascinating part. For the people who are like in remote parts of Africa or Southeast Asia, they're Muslim or, they're expecting to see like 13 of this, and like some
very specific things.
They go into the afterlife and they see a man and they immediately know that it's Jesus.
Yeah.
And so when they come back, now they're surrounded in this culture.
Yeah.
And they know the truth, and they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And it's like a personal crisis for them. So, when I hear stories like that, they have no reason to lie. They're not, what are they gaining?
Yeah.
So, and many of them are very reluctant. Many of them, especially the ones with the hellish experience, don't want to share that they had a hellish experience, because that's an indictment of them and in their life. So I'm just listening to all this. I'm like, there's something much more than we're allowed to actually talk about, or people even want to acknowledge that is happening.
Yes.
And I almost feel like, you ever hear people say, oh, the Bible is filled with miracles from then, but how come there's no miracles now? And I was like, because we won't even believe it.
No, well, I know. And the reality is there actually are.
Yeah.
It's not like, the Bible is a recording of major events in salvation history over the course of human history, right? It's not a record of absolutely everything. And so, but there, how carefully are you looking? Things do happen. I also think, this is my sort of private theory, is that what happens with the spread of the gospel is that it works its way across the surface of the earth, and there's kind of people that are behind the front culturally, way back from the front, and then there's people that are right on the front. Well, if you're in Europe or the United States, you are way back from the front. We have the benefit of this. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's massive conversions still taking place, or in East Asia, where there are massive conversions taking place, that's the front, right? And so there's a kind of spiritual warfare that's happening there. You'll hear about missionaries will tell you, they're in Haiti or someplace, they will see spiritual manifestations that we don't see. And so I think part of it is that we're sort of protected from those kinds of things. And also, it may be that the spiritual forces of darkness don't really want to manifest themselves to us, because a lot of us don't actually believe they exist, right? So the last thing you'd want to disturb an atheist is when, furniture starts moving around the room and things like that. C.S. Lewis said that, it's something like the demons in those kinds of cultures, or the wise ones, are very careful to not sort of manifest their existence.
Right. Well, we're nearing the end. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I usually ask one final question. Are you optimistic about the future?
I'm optimistic about the future at the macro scale.
Okay.
I think of a great, I'll paraphrase it, quote from Malcolm Muggeridge, that he was talking about Christianity. He said, the thing about Christianity is that the whole world can be against you, but the universe is for you, And so you could be right in the middle of something that's very, very bad, but the macro story is going to turn out well. We know how that ends. I think that's true too. What we don't know is what is the place of the United States of America in that? Are we reaching the end here, or are we at a stage of just kind of slow decline, or is renewal and recovery possible? Do we still have a kind of positive role to play? I hope so. I've spent my time full time and all my colleagues on that proposition that, in fact, things can be renewed and we can recover the things we've lost. But I think that is an open question, in part because we have free will, and a lot of that's going to be up to the American people to decide. I don't think that without a profound cultural and spiritual awakening or reawakening, that any kind of our political activities will ultimately succeed. I think we need both of those things. We need good policy, we need good politicians, but we also need a God-fearing and virtuous culture and people, and we need both of those things. And without the two, I think that the future could be dim, but with it, I think the future could be bright.
Wow. Well, in general, I'm an optimistic person. So I think throughout American history, we've had high points and low points.
Yep.
I think in some ways right now we're experiencing a low point. But in the same way, a few years ago, we've been like, it's going to be official. Gender affirming care is going to stay. And here we are. We just talked about half the states have already said you can't do it. Yeah. So, change is going to happen. I'm just glad that there are people like yourself. And we're going to see Moms for Liberty tomorrow. These people are real people who are fighting back.
Yeah.
and they're helping on the process to restoring sanity.
Absolutely.
Excuse me. And I feel like protecting children shouldn't be a Republican or conservative matter.
Absolutely.
It's an American matter.
Yep.
And we have to let the people in charge know that we're unified in that understanding. And we have to reinforce like common sense.
Absolutely.
Like, we shouldn't let children be overly medicated for something that they claim to feel, but
Yes, and that very often they grow out of.
that they,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's right.
But thank you once again
Absolutely, Adam. So good to be with you.
as well.